It is 3 in the morning. A remote training range in the American Southwest. A small unit of operators that most of the men on this base have never heard of has just completed a night assault exercise that the instructors running it cannot fully account for. The times are wrong. Not wrong in the sense of failure. Wrong in the sense that they should not be possible for a unit of this size, this equipment, this level of prior coordination with the Americans running the exercise. The debrief room is quiet in a way that debriefs are not usually quiet. But to understand how a Polish Special Forces unit ended up in a room full of U.S. Special Forces operators with no one knowing exactly what to say, you need to go back to before anyone on that base knew what GROM was, and to the decision that brought them there. Because what the Poles were about to demonstrate over the next 72 hours was something the American operators had not been briefed to expect. The Jednostko Wojskowa GROM, military unit GROM, the name and acronym for Grupa Reagowania Operacyjnego, or Operational Maneuver Response Group, was established in 1990 by the Polish government in direct response to the threat posed to Polish citizens abroad by international terrorist organizations. The founding of a unit followed the assassination of several Polish citizens connected to humanitarian operations in the Middle East, and the Polish government's recognition that the post-Cold War security environment demanded a capability that conventional military and police forces were structurally unable to provide. The unit's first commander, Colonel Slavomir Petelicki, built GROM from the ground up on a philosophy borrowed from the Western Special Forces tradition, specifically from the British SAS model, which itself had been refined across 4 decades of counterterrorism and direct action operations. Petelicki had studied the SAS with the particular intensity of a man who understood that the new Poland, finally free of Soviet influence, needed to earn its place in the Western security architecture not through political alignment alone, but through demonstrated capability. Grom's selection process was, from the beginning, deliberately punishing. The attrition rate in the early courses approached 80%. The physical standards were modeled on the most demanding Western equivalents and then adjusted upward in specific areas: endurance, cold weather operation, and psychological resilience under sustained stress. By the mid-1990s, the unit had begun building an operational record that was, for reasons of classification and the general obscurity of Polish special operations in the Western press, almost entirely unknown outside the intelligence and special forces communities of its allies. Before we go further, if stories about elite units and the moments that define them are the kind of content you are here for, subscribe to Deep Insight right now and turn on notifications. Every week there is another story like this one waiting for you. Now back to the question that nobody on that American base had yet thought to ask, the invitation that would test every assumption they had brought with them to the exercise. In the late 1990s, Poland's accelerating integration into NATO created a series of joint exercises between Polish and American military units that ranged from conventional combined arms training to specialized direct action scenarios involving special operations forces on both sides. For the Americans, these exercises served a doctrinal purpose: assessing the capabilities of allied units, identifying interoperability gaps, and establishing the kind of working relationships that joint operations in contested environments require. For GROM, the invitation to participate in a joint training exercise with a U.S. Special Forces unit on American soil represented something more specific. It was an opportunity to be evaluated by people whose professional opinion carried institutional weight, people whose assessment on Allied units' capability would filter into the reports and recommendations that shaped NATO's understanding of what GROM actually was versus what it claimed to be. The Americans who received the initial briefing on the incoming Polish unit responded in a way that was professional and almost universally miscalibrated. They knew the name GROM from the classification channels. They understood it was Poland's primary counterterrorism and direct action unit. What they did not know, what almost no one outside a small group of Allied intelligence professionals knew, was the operational pace GROM had been running since its establishment, the training regimen its operators endure between deployments, and the specific doctrinal choices its founders had made about how a small elite unit should fight. The result was a set of assumptions that arrived at the American base before the Polish operators did. And those assumptions raised a question that the next 72 hours would answer definitively: whether GROM belonged in the same conversation as the units they were about to train alongside. The Polish operators arrived in the American Southwest carrying equipment that was, to the eyes of the American instructors watching them disembark, a generation behind. The weapons were familiar, HK platform variants, but the loadout configuration, the ancillary equipment, and the communications kit were visibly less advanced than the American equivalent. The vehicle fleet assigned to the exercise was American and standardized. The Polish unit's personal gear stood out against the backdrop of American military equipment in a way that was noted and filed away by people who were, at that point, already forming a picture. The initial interaction between the American and Polish operators had the particular texture of a first meeting between professionals who are sizing each other up while maintaining the surface courtesies of Allied cooperation. The American operators were polite and efficient. The Polish operators were precise and almost entirely silent in the early hours, a quality that some of the Americans interpreted as reserve, and others, more accurately, as a particular stillness of people who prefer to demonstrate rather than describe. The first joint briefing covered the structure of the exercise, a 72-hour program of escalating scenarios, each building on the last, beginning with daylight direct action drills and culminating in a full night assault exercise on the final evening. The American instructors ran the briefing. The Polish operators listened without questions. At the end, one of the American instructors made a remark, not unkind, but not careful either, about the importance of the Polish unit keeping pace with the exercise tempo. The GROM colonel commanding the Polish contingent smiled and said nothing. 48 hours later, none of that would matter. The first day of the exercise was, by design, weighted in the Americans' favor. The scenarios had been built around U.S. Special Operations doctrine, the assault geometries, the communication protocols, the task organization models were all native to the American unit and new to the Poles. The intent was not to disadvantage the Allied unit deliberately, but to establish a common framework before the scenarios escalated. In the first two iterations, the American operators moved through the assault sequences with a fluency that comes from thousands of repetitions. Their execution was clean, fast, and precisely coordinated, the product of a training system that is, by almost any objective measure, the most resource-intensive and technically sophisticated in the world. The timing on the first scenario was strong. The second was faster. The American instructors observing the iterations recorded the results with the quiet satisfaction of people watching something they had spent years building perform at the level it was designed to reach. The Polish operators in the same scenarios were competent and methodical. Their times were not as fast as the Americans' times in those first two iterations. They made no attempt to explain the differential and offered no commentary on the scenarios. When the American instructors provided post-iteration feedback, the GRM operators absorbed it with the attentiveness of people who are listening specifically for tactical information and filtering everything else. By mid-afternoon, the tone of the exercise had settled into a particular groove. The Americans clearly ahead on the scenarios built around their own doctrine. The Poles absorbing the methodology with a speed that a few of the instructors had begun to notice but had not yet discussed with each other. And then came what the Poles showed them at dusk on the rifle range. The marksmanship phase was not scheduled to be a competitive element of the exercise. It was a familiarization component, a chance for both units to operate on the same range with the same target arrays, establishing a baseline before the integrated assault scenarios of Day 2. The American operators shot well, as they consistently do. The standards are high and the training investment in marksmanship across U.S. Special Operations is substantial and sustained. What the American instructors did not anticipate was a particular quality of the Polish shooting. Not the scores, though the scores were precise and high, but the methodology. Grom's marksmanship training had been built on a European tradition that emphasized mental discipline and trigger control over raw repetition volume. The Polish operators on a range that evening shot with stillness and a deliberateness that produced results that were, in several cases, measurably superior to the American equivalent at the target distances the range offered. The American instructors said nothing specific. They recorded the data. A few of them exchanged glances across the range at the Polish operators, downrange and focused on their targets. Did not see. The glances said something that was not quite surprise and not quite concern. More the particular recalibration of professionals who have encountered something that does not fit the framework they arrived with. The GROM colonel, shooting alongside his operators, set down his weapon, checked the target, and looked back at the range without expression. He had seen the glances. He understood what they meant. And what happened on the morning of day 2 reset every assumption in that room before the first scenario had even begun. Day 2 began at 4 in the morning. The scenario was a coordinated compound clearance, a 2-building complex on the training range, simulated hostile occupants, a hostage element in the secondary structure, a hard time limit. Both units would run it separately, and the times would be compared. It was the first direct head-to-head comparison of the exercise. The American unit ran the scenario first. Their execution was exceptional, the kind of polished, coordinated assault that results from years of joint training and the deep institutional knowledge of how a specific group of people moves together under stress. They hit the primary building fast, maintained communication discipline throughout, found the hostage element, and extracted within the time window that the instructors had assessed as a standard for a high-performing unit on this specific scenario. The Polish unit ran at 40 minutes later. They had been given no feedback on the American time. They had not asked. The GROM colonel briefed his operators for 6 minutes in Polish. They checked their equipment, and they moved to the start position. What followed was observed in silence by the American instructors and operators who had gathered, with a particular casualness of people who expect to be watching something educational rather than competitive. The Polish assault on the primary building was faster than the American equivalent. The transition to the secondary structure was executed with a route geometry that one of the American instructors later said he had not seen used in that configuration before. The hostage extraction time was, when the instructors checked their stopwatches, measurably inside the American benchmark. The debrief room that evening held both units together for the first time. And the question hanging over the room, the question nobody was willing to be the first to ask aloud, was the one that the timesheets in the instructors' hands had already answered. The final exercise was a night assault, the scenario that the entire program had been building toward. A complex multi-structure target, degraded communications, a simulated explosive threat in the primary building, and a time window that the American instructors had privately calibrated as achievable for their unit under optimal conditions and unlikely for any unit that had not trained specifically for this configuration. Both units would assault simultaneously, each assigned a different target structure within the same complex, requiring coordination between them in real time without the benefit of shared doctrine, established communication habits, or the kind of micro-level mutual understanding that comes from months of integrated training. It was designed to stress both units and to reveal the specific failure modes that emerge when elite operators from different national traditions are asked to work together under pressure. The night exercise began at 0200. It lasted 54 minutes. When it ended, the American operators who had been observing from the command position had a particular problem. They had expected to be the reference point against which the Polish performance would be measured. Instead, in 2 of the 3 assessed categories, Grom's times and execution quality were marginally ahead. In the 3rd category, communications interoperability, which had never been a fair comparison given the equipment differential, the Americans were ahead by a significant margin. The honest accounting of the night exercise produced a result that the American instructors had not prepared a framework for. The debrief the following morning lasted 3 hours. And what the senior American operator said after the room had been quiet for long enough is what this story is actually about. The senior American operator's assessment of the Polish unit, delivered in the debrief and later formalized in the after-action report, was direct in a way that American military culture reserves for moments when professional honesty takes precedence over institutional comfort. He said that GROM had performed at a level that he had not expected, that in specific assessed categories they had equaled or exceeded his unit's performance, and that the assumptions as people had arrived had not survived contact with the Polish operators on a range and in the assault scenarios. He said this without qualification and without the kind of diplomatic hedging that inter-allied assessments often produce. What he also said, and this is a part of the assessment that carries the most weight, was that the Polish unit's performance had been achieved on equipment that was, in several respects, inferior to the American equivalent, that the gap in communications technology had been the primary factor in the one category where the Americans had outperformed GROM, and that if the equipment differential were removed, the assessment would need to be reconsidered in its entirety. The American operators who had been on the range and in the scenarios during those 72 hours did not need the formal assessment to reach their own conclusions. The conversations that happened between the two units on the final evening, the informal debriefs, the shared meals, the kind of professional exchange that occurs when operators from different traditions recognize something in each other, carried a different quality from the first evening's polite distance. None of that informed conversation made it into the formal record. What did make it into the formal record was the document that crossed the desk of U.S. Special Operations Command 3 weeks later. The Polish operators who returned from the American exercise brought back more than a positive assessment. They brought back a specific and uncomfortable list. Grom's after-action process was, by the unit's design, as forensic in defeat as it was in success, more so in many respects. Every scenario from the 72 hours was reviewed in detail. The categories in which the Poles had performed at or above the American level were acknowledged, recorded, and set aside. The categories in which they had underperformed, and the specific reasons for each, were the subject of the debrief sessions that followed for the next 2 weeks. The communications equipment deficit was the most tractable item on the list. It was a resource problem, which meant it was a solvable problem, which meant it was, in the GROM commander's analysis, not the most important item. The most important items were the ones that could not be solved with procurement decision. The specific scenarios in which the American operators had displayed a quality of integrated team movement that Grom's training had not yet fully replicated. The Americans' ability to operate as a coherent unit under communications degradation, to maintain tactical cohesion when the technology failed, was a product of years of joint training at a volume and intensity that Poland's defense budget had not previously been able to sustain. That observation went into the GROM commander's formal recommendations to the Polish Defense Ministry. It was the beginning of a sustained campaign to increase the unit's joint training exposure, a campaign that would, over the following decade, produce a GROM that was measurably different from the one that had arrived at that American training range. But the question that the Poles quietly asked themselves on the flight home, whether the performance gap they had identified in themselves would have changed the outcome if it had not existed, had an answer that nobody wrote down. The joint training exercise between GROM and the U.S. Special Forces unit left a specific mark on both organizations, though the nature of that mark was different on each side. For the Americans, the exercise produced a recalibration of how they brief Allied special operations units in joint training environments. The assumption that a newer unit from a formerly Soviet-aligned nation would require significant upward adjustment before it could operate at a useful level in combined scenarios was not an assumption that survived the GROM exercise intact. The after-action report that reached Special Operations Command contributed to a broader revision of how Polish capabilities were assessed in the NATO planning architecture, a revision that would become significantly more consequential when Poland became a NATO member in 1999 and GROM began operating in joint missions in the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. For GROM, the exercise confirmed something the unit's founders had believed since its establishment, that a small, precisely selected, intensively trained unit operating with the right doctrinal framework could compete at the level of the world's best special operations forces without matching their resource base. The confirmation mattered not because it was unexpected, but because it came from a source whose professional credibility was beyond question. What neither unit's formal record captured, what lived only in the recollections of the operators who were there, was the assessment that both sides quietly arrived at during those final evening conversations on the training range. The assessment that both units agreed on, operator to operator, away from the official channels. The one that neither side ever made public. Because in the world of special operations, some assessments carry more weight when they stay exactly where they were spoken. The story of GROM and those 72 hours on an American training range is not simply a story about a unit that surprised people who underestimated them. It is a story about what happens when the assumptions that institutions carry into a room are tested by operators who did not arrive with the same assumptions, and what both sides are left with when the scores are posted and the room goes quiet. Elite units are defined not by what they achieve when conditions are optimal, but by what they produce when conditions are not. GROM arrived with inferior equipment, no home advantage, and an intelligence deficit about the specific scenarios they would face. What they produce in those conditions is the measure of what the unit actually was. Deep Insight covers stories like this one, the moments inside elite operations that formal records do not fully capture. If this one gave you something, subscribe so you are there for the next one. Hit like so more people find this story. And leave a comment with your answer to this. When two elite units face each other and neither wants to lose, what is it that actually decides which one doesn't?